Mies van der Rohe, another architect, was the third director. He created iconic statements like "less is more" and "God is in the details." He designed the iconic Barcelona Pavilion, or the equally iconic Barcelona chair, which is pictured here. I have to tell you that I own 2 Barcelona chairs, and when my son was a toddler, I was fascinated to find that of all the furniture in our home, he chose to always sit in those chairs because they're just so comfortable. Mies' entrance into the Bauhaus was never going to be easy. Hans Meyer had been dismissed from the school in 1930 by Dessau's mayor for politicizing the students with his communist views and suggested Mies van der Rohe. Mies entered the school as a member of German's avant-garde, imposing his own ideas about what modern design should be. A year later, taking on the thankless task of directing the Bauhaus at an extremely charged political moment, Mies seemed to view the situation in Germany more as an annoyance that got in the way of work. This was in some ways the point. He was to be the apolitical director after the openly communist Meyer, who would steer the school clear of any further political scrapes, particularly with the Nazi Party. Political discussions were to be avoided. Activism was repressed. There was, however, a shift almost completely toward architecture. Furniture, metal, and mural workshops were merged into interior design. At this time, Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky had problems, and Klee left. Kandinsky found himself sort of twiddling his thumbs, and Mies paid for the Bauhaus's final home in Berlin, which was an abandoned telephone factory. He used his own money to rent a derelict factory in Berlin that served as the short-lived third home for the Bauhaus during its lesser-known year in the German capital. Students worked to rehabilitate the factory and for almost a year worked undisturbed until the Gestapo raided the school, suspecting it of producing anti-Nazi propaganda. How much Mies was attempting to establish modernism as apolitical in order to survive under the Nazis is debatable, but this quickly proved ineffective. The Nazi Party gained control of Dessau's city council. It closed the Bauhaus. Mies protested, and eventually the school was allowed to reopen, provided certain teachers, including Kandinsky, were replaced with individuals who would better support Nazi principles. Mies and the other staff members found it impossible and deemed it better to voluntarily close the school themselves. The new typography style characteristics are asymmetrical flush left, ragged right, assigning a priority to the text based on weight and size, again, communications about functioning, not decoration, using type in a very simple form without embellishment, and rules would be used for emphasis. This is Jan Tichold. Many innovations in graphic design occurred outside mainstream society. The person who applied these new design approaches to everyday problems and explained them to a wide audience was Tichold. He wrote a 24-page insert called Elementary Typography that was published in the October 1925 issue of Typographic Impartations. This was at a time when much German printing still used textura type and symmetrical layouts. Tichold's insert generated a lot of enthusiasm from printers, typesetters, and designers, and in 1928 he published his book, The New Typography, which rejected decoration in favor of rational design, planned for concise communication. Other characteristics include asymmetry, the use of sans serif type flush to the left margin, an underlying vertical and horizontal structure, like a grid, spatial intervals as important design elements, and rules, bars, and boxes for structure, balance, and emphasis. The precision and objectivity of photography was preferred to illustration. Tichel's own design practice set the standard for the new approach in books, job printing, ads, and posters. In 1933, armed Nazis entered his flat and arrested Jan Tichold. He was accused of creating un-German typography and denied his teaching position in Munich. So again, the Nazis favored much of the typography that we saw in the war posters from Placket Steel, those black letter fonts. After his release, which was lobbied for by many people, he fled immediately with his family to Switzerland. And sadly, he began to turn away from the new typography and to work in a more humanistic tradition. Tichold is recognized for bringing the new typography to fruition as an expression of the 20th century, and he really spearheaded a revival of classical typography in later years. So when you show images on the new typography page in your journal, make sure that what you select from Jan Tichold looks more like this, not like those more humanistic pieces that he did later in his career. The style that you're looking at in this slide really showcases what he was trying to do with the new type. Tichold declared the aim of every typographic work to be the delivery of a message in the shortest, most efficient manner. Types, he believed, should be elementary in form without embellishment. So of course he picked sans serif type in a range of weights: light, medium, bold, and extra bold. Different proportions like condensed, normal, and expanded, and italic in similar weights and proportions. This was declared to be the modern type. He showed how the modern art movement could relate to graphic design as well by synthesizing his practical understanding of type and its traditions with a lot of new experiments. The Nazi Party increased its harassment of the school, and on August 10, 1933, one of the most important design schools of the 20th century shut its doors. Many of the faculty immigrated to the U.S., where they influenced the course of American design and design education after World War II. Among the new sans serif typefaces were Gill Sans, designed by Eric Gill, who was influenced by railway type designed by his teacher and friend Edward Johnston for the London Underground. Although a sans serif font, the proportions of Gill stem from the Roman tradition. He was a complex and colorful figure who really defies categorization in the history of graphic design, but may be best known for designing the Gill Sans type series. Some of his activities included stonemasonry, inscription carving for monuments, sculpture, wood engraving, typeface design, lettering, book design, and he was a brilliant writer. Here we see Paul Renner, who designed the Futura typeface, which had 15 variations, including 4 italics and 2 unusual display faces, and really became the most widely used geometric sans serif family. He was a teacher and a designer who fought tirelessly for the notion that designers should not merely preserve their inheritance and pass it on to the next generation unchanged, but rather each generation should try to solve inherited problems and try to create a contemporary form that was true to its time. Here's Rudolf Koch. He was a German type designer who was also a master of lettering, calligraphy, type, and illustration. He's commonly known for his typefaces that he created for the Klingspor Type Foundry. Scientist and mathematician Marie Reitermeister headed the transformation team, which was responsible for converting verbal and numerical data that was compiled by statisticians and researchers into a layout form. Now, Gerd Arndts designed most of the pictographs, and he cut them on linoleum blocks and printed them on a letterpress, then pasted them into finished artworks. And here we see some of the examples. The impact of this includes research toward the development of a universal visual language system and extensive use of pictographs in signage and information systems. So when you go to places like an airport, you see pictograms all over because they help people understand how to do things even if they don't speak the language. This is Henry Seebeck's diagrammatic interpretation of the London Underground subway system, which replaced the geographic approach to mapping, and it really served as a model for other variations throughout the world and influenced the visual presentation of diagrams and networks. This is the work of Swiss designer and photographer Herbert Matter. He studied with Fernand Léger, and he worked at a type foundry as a photographer and type designer. He even assisted A.M. Cassandra in poster design when he lived in Paris. When he returned to Switzerland, he was tasked with designing posters for the Swiss National Tourist Office. His posters of the 1930s expanded the role of photography as a graphic communications tool. He used collage and montage. Notice that he integrated photography and typography, and he used extreme contrast of scale to enhance communication. These Swiss tourism posters are still incredibly popular today. I mentioned that I was lucky to teach in Switzerland, in Zurich, and you'll see these posters. They're historical, they're collectible, they're beautifully designed, and they still inspire new generations of graphic designers. Does the Bauhaus make an impression on designers today? Well, here is a show that was held at MoMA, all on the Bauhaus. It had a major impact on art and architecture trends in Western Europe, the US, Canada, and Israel, especially in the city of Tel Aviv. In the decades following its closure, the great news is many of the artists involved fled or they were exiled by the Nazi regime. Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy reassembled in Britain during the mid-30s to live and work before the war caught up with them. Both Gropius and Breuer went to teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and worked together before their professional split. The Harvard School was enormously influential in America in the late 20s and early 30s. In the late 30s, Mies van der Rohe resettled in Chicago, enjoying the sponsorship of the influential Philip Johnson, and became one of the preeminent architects in the world. Moholy-Nagy also went to Chicago and founded the new Bauhaus School under the sponsorship of industrialist and philanthropist Walter Popecki. So I've got my own family Bauhaus story. It's not actually my side of the family, but my husband's side. At the beginning of the chapter, I mentioned my mother-in-law, who's an architect. Cuban-born furniture and interior designer Clara Porcet is best known for modern designs inspired by the local traditions of Mexico, her adopted homeland. At Black Mountain College, she took courses taught by Joseph Albers, modeled closely upon the courses he had taught at the Bauhaus School. Porcet kept a lifelong friendship with Albers and his wife Ani, and stayed true to the tenets of the Bauhaus throughout her career. My mother-in-law became her assistant, and they worked together for many years. As I said, Claire was born in Cuba to a well-off family, but she did not agree with Batista, who she felt had used fraud and intimidation to secure his presidency. At the architectural studio where my mother worked in Mexico, Claire hid Che Guevara, or Dr. Guevara, as my mother-in-law calls him. Then my in-laws smuggled him out of Mexico City to the south, the ranch of Clara's brother, where Guevara trained for the Cuban Revolution. The ideas and forms of the Bauhaus can be found in design schools and mainstream stores and continue to inspire us today.